I'm talking today about the kinds of mathematical entities that are involved in disciplines like microeconomics and so forth. There is a parallel talk, which is about historico-legal entities, such as claims and obligations. But today I'm going to focus on the mathematical ones, although, as you will see, there are a lot of examples which cover both territories. And here are some examples. Turbotax is a computer device which is both of legal significance and of mathematical significance. It creates new kinds of entities. And it's historical. There was a first issue of Turbotax, and Turbotax has existed ever since that first issue. And a tax, for similar reasons, is a mathematical entity that also has legal and historical features. And then the dollar, which I'll talk about later on, is a mathematical entity in the sense that it is involved in all kinds of mathematical data manipulations and all kinds of everyday transactions when Kevin buys his bottles of claret. And I'll be talking about the dollar also. And the dollar, too, is a historical entity. It started to exist at a certain point in time. So these are digital artifacts. These are political, legal entities with mathematical characteristics. On the other hand, and then these are economic entities with mathematical characteristics of various different sorts. And I will not deal with all of these. For many of them, there is a contrast between the type and the instances. And I will try and get some clarity about the relation between types and instances, which is a very complicated one in this territory. And I guess the long-term goal is that if we can get clear about the types and the instances in these kinds of areas, then we will be in a better state to have a general ontology of law and economics, or general ontologies of law and economics, which I think many people in this room are, in one way or another, searching for. All right, so what do we mean? I didn't use the word so once. So what do we mean by historico-mathematical? The idea is that in the course of the history of philosophy, there have been various large-scale proposals as to what it is to exist in time. And this is very simplified. So don't blame me for getting Plato's Republic wrong, because I'm just making a general point. Namely, that for Plato in the Republic, on one reading, all of the things which exist in the fullest sense of the word are unchanging. So their history is very boring. There are no changes. They exist forever, and there are no changes at all. It's really very boring. For nominalists and logical positivists and practically all 20th century analytic philosophers, there are no things which are unchanging. So mathematical entities are not entities. They are logical constructions, ways of speaking. All of the things which really exist are part of the causal order. They change constantly. And then Aristotle recognized both kinds of entities which are unchanging, such as universals on the one hand, and then accidents, which are in the world of what happens and is the case. They are changing constantly. And now, what I mean by historico-mathematical is entities which exist in history, which are mathematical in nature. And my argument is that the first philosopher to get clear about these kinds of entities was Reinach. So in 1913, he published in Husserl's Jahrbuch this work, a book-length work on the a priori foundations of the civil law. And he there disclosed that there are entities which are unchanging, but which nevertheless have a history because they began to exist at a certain point in time and conceivably then cease to exist at a certain later point in time. So Reinach talks about social acts. He means something very much like what Searle means by speech acts. Social acts can bring entities into being entities which have no causal properties. And the examples that he talks about are things like claims and obligations, which are brought into being through a social act of promising. So for Reinach, there are three sorts of history. There are the unchanging things like numbers, states of affairs. There are the changing things such as people. And then finally, there are unchanging things which have a somewhat boring kind of history, but is still more interesting than the kind of history which is enjoyed by things which are abstract in the fullest sense of the word. And so the history looks like this. First of all, they don't exist, then they exist, then they don't exist again. But nothing happens in the meanwhile. And there are many such examples, some of which he talks about: property rights, laws, claims, and so on. And we'll be talking about more such examples as we go along. All right, now Reinach was part of what today I'm going to be calling the Munich, Göttingen, Krakow school of realist phenomenology. Reinach was a realist. He really believed in the existence of things like debts and claims and obligations and laws. And so did other members of this school. You can read their names here. This was a very lucky photograph. The gentleman third from the left, he looks as if he's third from the left, is Max Scheler, who anticipated some of the things which Reinach said. All right, so this is a picture of the leading figures in the Göttingen school, which is a school formed in part by refugees from Munich, including Reinach. So the man in the top is Husserl, I'm sure you all know. And then on the next level, we have Reinach and Edith Stein. Then we have Roman Ingarden, and then we have John Paul II. And it's noteworthy that this particular school has two saints in it. So Edith Stein has a similar kind of view about the state. So the state is an entity which has a history, but it's not unchanging. It's not quite as boringly simple to specify the history of the state from Stein's point of view, but there are features of the state which are unchanging for Stein. And we'll go into that somewhat later. But the idea that the state does not exist and then it exists at a certain point in history, and then conceivably it ceases to exist, and Poland ceased to exist, and then came back to life again later on. That kind of history is the kind of history that I'm interested in when I talk about mathematico-historical entity. Ingarden is another member of this Göttingen school, and Ingarden talks about literary works, musical works. He also talks about flags, which will form one of my examples. So I've trained myself in lexicolology, which is interesting. They have hundreds of different categories of flags. I'll be talking about the ontology of flags. Now, the dollar. Let's start with the dollar. You will see that this is very easy to do. Now, the dollar. No, hang on. No, I messed things up. The dollar began to exist in 1792 with the passing of the Coinage Act, which made it illegal to use any other kind of currency as legal tender in the new United States, except that which was issued by a specified process by the new mint. And so we know exactly on what day the dollar began to exist, and only in the course of time were actual instances of dollars in the form of physical coins and notes created by means of this process. They had to design the building, build the building by the printing and stamping machines and so forth. That took time. But the dollar itself existed before there were any dollars. And that is very interesting. And we're interested in the dollar now. We're not interested in the coins or the notes. And now Amazon.com was created on July the 5th, 1994. And it's existed ever since, and who knows, maybe it will exist forever. Now, John Searle has grasped the nettle disclosed by Reinach, namely, how do we understand how claims and obligations begin to exist without any causal effects when people make promises? His position goes something like this. We perform a speech act, for instance, the promising, and then there is a kind of magic which brings into being claims and obligations. Immediately, the claim and the obligation, they are mutually correlated. But for Searle, this magical power is just a matter of language. It's a definitional matter. It turns on the way people are taught to speak, that when they say, I promise to do X with a certain kind of intention, then they thereby become obliged to do X. And the person they're speaking to acquires the claim that X will indeed be done by the speaker. All of that is a matter of linguistic inferences. That's what the words mean. That's what he says. The way somewhat later he describes this is in terms of the X counts as Y in context C formula. So we have a sentence, will you marry me? Or yes, I will marry you in English, which is, according to Searle, just air vibrations or vibrations in the air and in the larynx. So that's what this wiggling line means here. That air vibration complex counts as a sentence in English. The sentence in English counts as a promise, and the promise counts as a marriage contract. And notice that we have identity here. And by the transitivity of identity, that wiggly thing down there, X1, is, in Searle's ontology, a marriage contract. For the early Searle, the marriage contract would be a social object, which is at the same time a physical object, because for Searle, there are only physical objects. For later Searle, because he realized the absurdity of the thesis that that thing down there, X1, is a marriage contract, he abandoned his early view and adopted a view according to which all of these social objects are, in fact, products of massive fantasy. And so he embraced a fictionalist view. This is the last resort of the physicalist position. All right, Reinach was a realist. And so he thought that when we make a promise, we bring into being immediately and non-causally really existing entities. We need a name for these entities, such as claims and obligations. And this is not a purely linguistic matter. It's a matter of the essence of promising and of the essence of authority to confer roles on people and so on. So there are all kinds of social essences which express themselves when we perform social acts of, for instance, promising. The problem for Searle is that there are no social objects anymore. There are only social facts, because he has to give some account of the fact that people behave in certain ways when they create these wiggly lines called acts of promising. He talks in terms of status functions, but in fact, the status functions are just products of beliefs, and those beliefs are neurobiological phenomena. So when I recognize Kevin as having the role of professor, my recognition is a neurobiological process in my brain about Kevin's neurobiological interactions with other people in Geneva and so forth. The problem is that we have mathematico-historical entities, which are the object of much activity in places like stock exchanges and banks. Now, when somebody examines Kevin's stock options on the basis of Kevin's bank account and draws calculations about the likely percent increase of particular investments, given Kevin's peculiar circumstances, then the historico-mathematical bank teller working with Kevin is manipulating entities like bank accounts, dollars, stock, other kinds of investments, collateralized debt obligations, and so on and so on. And according to Searle, the only things which exist here are neurobiological phenomena on the part of people. That is nonsense, given what happens in banks and investment agencies and so forth. And Searle believed that his social ontology is a contribution to understanding the science of the social world, and it fails when it comes to any mathematical aspect of the social world, in which he lives just as much as Kevin. Now, one person who recognized this and who became a realist about social objects in the process is Hernando de Soto, who is a an economist. He studied in Geneva originally and tried to take what he saw in Switzerland, the wonderful machinery of economics in Switzerland, back to Peru and bring Peru up to the level of Western capitalism. He saw that the way Western capitalism works depends upon the existence of documented things like mortgages and stock and shares and loans and so forth. These are, he says, the mechanisms for creating the institutional orders of Western capitalism. They represent a new dimension of socio-economic reality, which comes into existence. So these are the historico-mathematical entities that De Soto is talking about. They are real entities, and debts, for instance, are real entities, which we can divide into 100 equal parts, which we call shares, and then people who are not very rich can buy 2 or 3 shares in a large company and enjoy the advantages which come along with being invested in a large company as the value of those shares goes up, if you're lucky. All right, now the question is, what should these entities, these historico-mathematical entities, which are brought into being but which then exist in the way that other mathematical entities exist, namely without changing, what should we call them? Now, Peirce and some of his adherents talk about types and tokens. That won't work for reasons which are quite well known now, but I will explain in a minute. I called them quasi-abstract in the original papers that I wrote about problems with Searle's ontology of social objects. Now I'm just trying out experimentally the phrase historico-mathematical. I'm not sure if it will survive. But Charles Parsons talks about quasi-concrete mathematical entities. An example would be the set whose members are 1, 2, 3, and Napoleon. That would be a quasi-concrete object. It's not concrete because it's a set, and it's not abstract because it contains Napoleon as a member. And Stainton wanted to coin entities like this, abstractish entities, which I don't like. And Levinson, referring to particularly to musical works, which we will come back to, call them indicated structures. So a musical work for Levinson is like a complex universal pattern, but it's indicated because it was picked out by Bach or by some other composer. And I still think quasi-abstract is the best term. Now, why will types and tokens not work? Well, this is a traditional argument against types and tokens. So we consider the sentence, a rose is a rose is a rose. This contains 3 tokens of the one word type rose. But the problem is that this type occurs 3 times within that sentence as a type. So if we take the type, which is the sentence, a rose is a rose is a rose, then it contains 3 different somethings of the type rose. Now, what do we call these somethings? We can't call them tokens because the type doesn't have any tokens as part. So the stuff in blue is the type. This contains 3 somethings of the type rose. Those somethings cannot be tokens. It's been suggested that they should be called occurrences, which I don't like because occurrences belong to the realm of process. We're talking here about sentences on a screen. So we need, in any case, more than just the relation of being a token of. We need some relation which holds between types and types, which allow the same type to appear within a single larger type. This means that the type token approach to dealing with these quasi-abstract entities that I'm referring to is not going to work. The quasi-abstract, when I first proposed it, was defined as meaning both non-physical and non-psychological, but tied to time and history. And these were the examples I gave. So I still think that's better than types and tokens, but we still have the question of understanding how quasi-abstract entities such as my debt to Kevin, which is an instance, and quasi-abstract type level entities such as the dollar or the French Tricolore, how do they relate to each other? So in other words, how do instances and universals or quasi-universals in the realm of quasi-abstract entities relate to each other. That is still an open issue. A lot of the examples of quasi-abstract entities are boundary or boundary-related entities. In 2000 already, quasi-abstract character of things like postal districts and voting districts and countries that don't have coastlines was discussed. And Mulligan, in his paper on Searle and Derrida, talks about social and cultural entities such as voting, money, tools, institutions, and word meanings are not merely bound idealities, which we'll come back to in a minute. Rather, they are entities which depend on collective intentionality, on we attitudes, both in order to come into being and for their continued existence. Now, I think this idea of collective intentionality, which Searle, of course, talks about, is important because what we're talking about when we talk about things like the dollar is entities which are generically dependent upon the existence of coins and notes. In other words, there have to be dollar coins for the dollar to exist, but they're also collectively dependent upon the willingness of individual parties, for instance, population of America, to accept those dollar notes and coins. So we have both generic dependence, which means there have to be some coins and notes, and collective dependence, which means there have to be people who collectively accept the entity in question as being an entity which it claims to be. And now the really important thing is that for dollars and states and the articles of somebody's will, these collective dependence relations have to obtain across time, including from one generation to the next. And so the idea of collective dependence, I think, is an important idea. Scheler and Edith Stein seem to have understood this also, that collective dependence can reach across generations. What does she say about the state? It's a sovereign sphere of power with its own governing state power. The idea is that it's self-constituting. The state doesn't have any power until the state exists. How does the state come into existence? By claiming to have this power to exist. This is what happened in 1776, they say, in what was then not the United States. State and law, she says, come to life at the same time. So when the United States came into being, they had to claim legal authority over the whole jurisdiction. And in making that claim and making it stick, they brought the state into existence. Because they succeeded in making it stick, they succeeded in bringing the state into existence. But for the first N years of its existence, it may not have existed because it failed. This is what happened to the Confederacy. It claimed to exist, but the government of the Confederacy was not able to make its claim to exist and to have law-giving power forceful for long enough to establish itself as being an entity which could be recognized by other states, particularly by its northern neighbor. And then within that jurisdiction, the state has exclusive right to institute laws. She also says that it has exclusive right to determine the sphere of persons for whom those laws apply, and that reaches over generations, so that all the children and all the children's children. And these are the various components. I've given you a shortened version. So there are organs of the state. There's the sovereign domain, there's the authority of the organs of the state, and so on. There is this paper by Amy Thomason. She is one of the few analytic philosophers who has paid attention to the existence of this realist phenomenological tradition. And she talks about Ingarden's account of, for instance, architectural works. For Ingarden, an architectural work and a building are two different things. The architectural work is not made of physical matter. It's dependent upon the building as physical matter. But his argument is that the architectural work can be changed, can even be destroyed, while the building itself is not changed. And his example would be You have a beautiful church, which is recognized by everybody as a beautiful architectural work, but somebody builds a 6-lane highway immediately in front of it so that you can't actually see the front of the church anymore. And that, he said, would effectively destroy the original work, but nothing in the building itself would necessarily change. But more interestingly still, she points out that Ingarden, in his work on the ontology of works of art, talks about the ontology of flags. So buildings, flags, and churches, that's a very interesting phrase. I'm going to tell you about the history of the Tricolore. So it existed for 20 years, and then it didn't exist because the Bourbons came back, pulled down all these horrible Tricolore. But then it came back again for a bit in 1815, and then the Bourbons came back for 15 years, and then it came back again for 18 years. But now it switched around and it changed color. It started to exist on the 15th of February, 1794. And then we have the Bourbon Restoration, which closed it down for a while. Someone else changed the blue to match the European Union flag. But then Macron changed it back again. But no one noticed. So it's one flag. Like Poland, it had gaps in its existence. But it's one flag. It also changes color over time. Its color is sometimes well-defined, sometimes not well-defined. It's blue, who cares? But it's one flag nonetheless. And now it changes, as you can see. So these lines here are meant to indicate this historico-mathematical. I'll explain why this is mathematical in a minute. Historical-mathematical existence, where you just exist for a time and then you're changed. Then you don't exist for a time. And so on. And the reason why I have a question mark underneath the Kingdom of France is because it seems odd to me that the Bourbons let the Tricolore come back. All right, now, this is what Ingarden says. Thus, the flag has a real object as its bearer, which is the piece of cloth, or it could be a pile of ink patterns, or it could be a pile of pixels, but goes beyond that real object in the properties constitutive of and essential to it, the flag. The real object, the cloth, is not the sole foundation of the being of the flag. We need also the subjective attitude and the appropriate acts of consciousness, which create something like a church or a flag. And these form its second and perhaps far more important ontic foundation. So the flag is generically and collectively dependent upon people acknowledging it as well as on pieces of cloth. With a piece of cloth, he says, we clean pots. To the flag, we render military honors. We preserve it, often for centuries, as a remembrance, even though the cloth of the flag is badly damaged and so forth. And that's true. If you go to any of the capital cities of previously war-torn European countries, you will find buildings which contain flags, which are objects of reverence. There is the flag, and then there are very many tokens or instances of the flag, just as there is the novel War and Peace and the very many copies of this novel. And I think the relation is very similar, and Ingarden thinks the relation is very similar. So the difference between the tricolor, the flag, and all the cloth copies of that flag is that the tricolor was a product of a very special creative politico-legislative act. And it's since then been the object of many more politico-legislative acts. For instance, specifying the allowed colors. How then do flag instances relate to these quasi-abstract objects of reference, which we call the tricolor? Instances are not occurrences. Well, maybe they're embodiments. That might be a possible phrase. I don't think we can call them individualizations or manifestations or realizations. We certainly can't call them performances. But I think that the word performance is important here because I think the relation between the flag, and the individual pieces of cloth is very much like the relationship between the musical work and performances of the musical work. Beethoven's Ninth Symphony began to exist in January 1824, and the early movements were finished earlier, so maybe they existed earlier. But the symphony then, it exists ever since. It will go on existing for a long time, we hope. And it exists in virtue of the fact that it is at least possible for people to perform it. And that is true because there are scores and there are orchestras, and the scores serve as instructions to the orchestras on how to perform it. That the score is an information artifact, but the ability of the performers to perform a work are dispositions which have to be trained and retrained in successive generations of conductors and composers and music hall managers and so forth in order to make possible the continued existence of the work. Exactly the same thing applies to war and peace. People have to be trained to read, to understand the Russian novel, and so forth. Waldemar Conrad, who is a member of the Göttingen school and is of no relation to Theodor Conrad, who was a member of the Munich school, nor to Hedwig Conrad Matthias, who was the wife of Theodor Conrad. And I couldn't find a picture of Waldemar Conrad anywhere. He had an idea that the work of music is an ideal object for which it is essential that it be realizable in performances and in acts of performers and audience members. And he said that they are bound idealities in Husserl's sense. Now, he had arguments with Ingarden about this claim, and Ingarden himself then developed in the course of these arguments his theories about aesthetic objects in general, according to which they are all what he called purely intentional. That would imply that the flag is a purely intentional object, which is not physical in any sense, just as the architectural work, which is a church building, is a purely intentional object, which is not physical, which is dependent upon a physical building. And similarly for the ontological structure of the work of art, when we read a work of art, we concretize all of these different levels or strata. And we do this because we're trained to read, when we read a work, to read it in such a way that we hear, in some sense, the sounds of the words, we understand the meanings of the words, we understand the objects that the words are describing, and we understand the aspects of those objects which are presented to us through the words. And then conceivably, we also apprehend value qualities. And now a literary work itself is not any of those things. It's stratified. It exists because people create stratified readings or concretizations of the work. And as they read the work and create concretizations, these concretizations will change. So the work itself will change. So the story goes, the author creates the manuscript, which enables the production of copies of the work by publishers, which enable readings of the work by readers. And then the work is collectively and generically dependent on the succession of these concretizations, which change over time and thereby account for what Ingarden calls the life of the literary work. All right, so now we have another example. I've been discussing this example with somebody called Elliot Hauser at University of Texas at Austin, who is interested in truth makers for data artifacts. And his thesis is that we are living in a world where data and data processing devices are determining in increasingly important ways what exists. And so the history of a time zone. So time zones exist. There was a time when they did not exist. And then they exist, and then they don't exist. We assume. One day the world will not have any time zones anymore because it won't have any people. And time zones, while they exist, they very often change. So they change because of daylight saving time. So for half the year, you are on one time. For another half of the year, you're on another time, but you're in the same time zone through the whole of this succession of 6 monthly periods. So this is what the history of a time zone looks like. Not all time zones have daylight saving time. Some of them are just straight lines. And now Israel has a time zone called the Israel time zone, which doesn't have what they call in the time zone database, timezonedb.com, a daylight saving time. But even more, there is a Palestine time zone. in fact, there may be two Palestine time zones. There's the Asia Gaza and the Asia Hebron Palestine time zones, both of which are equivalent to East European time. The history of a time zone can look like this, or it can be a straight line, but it can change in other ways because governments either want daylight saving time or they don't want daylight saving time, and they change their mind over time. And they switch back fairly soon afterwards because people realize after 3 years without daylight saving time that daylight saving time was actually a good idea. And so the government switches back. And so sometimes we have stretches during which there is no change. Now, some time zone histories are much more complicated. So China used to have 5 time zones. Now it's got 1 and a bit, 8 hours ahead of Greenwich Mean Time all the year round. This must be horrible at the relevant extremes. So this is data that we have about the flag of the United States. And you see the very first datum is very interesting because it has a Union Jack in it. And so just as a time zone can change over time, so a flag can change over time because of legislation. So these were all legislated to be the new flag of the United States. This is the complete history of this flag. And now we have one type, or we may think that we have one type and many tokens, but it's more complicated than that because we have many types. And this is a historico-mathematical type because it's a state counter. I think that's probably a good place to stop. Okay, that's the end.